The candles were lit. That detail matters to me now in a way it didn't then, that I had lit candles for this meal. Tapered ivory ones in the brass holders my mother brought back from Portugal 40 years ago, the ones I only put out for occasions worth marking. I had set the table on Saturday morning before the grocery run, smoothing the linen cloth twice with the flat of my hand the way I always do, checking that the folds at each corner hung evenly. 31 years of Sunday dinners in that house, and I still checked the corners. Some habits are not really habits. Some of them are a way of saying, this matters, and I am a person to whom things matter. The roast had been in since 10 o'clock that morning. I'd done a slow braise, short ribs, the way Gerald's mother used to make them, with red wine and thyme and a bay leaf he always said he could taste but probably couldn't. I had made the stock myself the day before, a Saturday afternoon standing at the stove while the autumn light moved across the kitchen floor in long yellow rectangles. I'd made a celery root puree, which is fussier than it sounds and requires patience. Most people don't want to spend on a side dish. There were roasted carrots with a green salad I'd dressed at the last minute so it wouldn't wilt. A loaf of bread I'd baked from a starter I've kept alive for 9 years. I want you to understand what was on that table, not because I am asking you to be impressed, but because I want you to understand what it means to put that kind of care into something and then watch what happens to it. Renata arrived at 1:30. She came in the way she always did, door opening before the bell finished ringing. Because Gerald had given her a key, which I had discovered from my neighbor and not from my husband, but that is a detail I will come back to. She had her coat still on when she walked into the dining room and stood there looking at the table with an expression I can only describe as preliminary. Like she was deciding something before she'd even sat down. Gerald came out of the kitchen behind her. He'd been in there with me for the last 10 minutes, though with me is generous. He was in the room, refilling the water pitcher, checking his phone, doing the low-level hovering that had become his version of help. He looked at Renata and then at me, and something passed between the two of them that I was not meant to catch. I caught it. I had been catching things like that for months by then. Small signals crossing over my head like weather systems I wasn't supposed to notice. We sat down. I served. This is what I do. I have always been the one who serves, who makes sure each plate is warm, who notices if someone looks like they wanted more of the carrots without asking for them. 34 years in hotel hospitality will do that to you. You learn to read a room the way other people read a clock. Automatically, without thinking, the information just arriving. I set Renata's plate in front of her. Short ribs, a generous spoonful of the pure carrots arranged in the way that had taken me a ridiculous amount of time to decide was the right way. She looked at it. The silence was only about 4 seconds long. I have replayed it enough times that I can be precise about that. 4 seconds while she looked at the plate, and then she picked it up with both hands, not to move it closer, not to make room, and pushed it away from her across the table. The sound the rim made against the linen was soft. Everything about the gesture was soft, in fact. She didn't slam it. She didn't raise her voice. She simply moved it away from herself, the way you'd move something that had been placed in front of you by mistake. "You call this dinner?" she said. "I want to be careful here, because I don't want you to think I simply sat there without a response forming somewhere inside me. I want to be honest with you. There was a response. There was something hot and immediate that moved through my chest in the half-second after she said it, but here is what I am only now able to articulate. It was not hurt. It was not even anger, not exactly. It was something quieter and stranger than either of those things. It was recognition, and then Gerald spoke. He didn't raise his voice either. He didn't make a scene. Gerald has never once in 31 years made a scene, which I used to think was a sign of his character, and have since revised my understanding of. He set his water glass down. He looked at me with an expression that was calibrated. I see that now, the calibration in it, the small practiced tilt of concern, and he said very gently, "She's right, Margaret. You've been off lately. You've been off lately." I have turned those 4 words over in my hands so many times in the months since it's that dinner that they have become smooth like sea glass. "You've been off lately," he did not say. "Renata, that is an extraordinarily rude thing to say to someone who cooked for you all day." He did not say, "I don't know what you mean by that." He did not even say nothing, which would have been a kind of cowardice I might have eventually forgiven. He agreed with her. He supplied her with language. He handed her the knife and then stood back while she used it. I looked at him for a moment, just a moment, and I want to tell you what I did not do. I did not cry. I did not push my own chair back and leave the room. I did not ask him what he meant, or tell Renata that she was welcome to cook the next Sunday meal herself, or say any of the things that were available to me. I did not perform my wound for either of them. I picked up my fork. I cut a piece of the short rib, which had braised for 4.5 hours and was, I can tell you objectively, perfect. I put it in my mouth and I chewed, and I looked at the candle flame nearest to me, which was very still in the windless room. And I thought, there it is. That is the only way I know to describe what happened inside me at that table. Not a breaking, not a collapse, a settling. The way a compass needle swings and then, when it finally finds true north, simply stops moving. I had been sensing the shape of something for months, a wrongness I couldn't name, discrepancies I'd been explaining away. A cold draft from a door I hadn't known was open. And in the 4 seconds it took Renata to push that plate across the table, and in the 4 words what Gerald used to confirm what she'd done, the shape finally became solid enough to hold. They did not know that yet. That was important. They were watching me reach for the bread basket, watching me offer the carrots to the empty air between us, as if nothing had happened. And they were drawing their own conclusion about what my composure meant. I know now what they thought it meant. They thought it meant I was exactly what they'd been constructing me as. A woman growing dim at the edges. A woman who could be nudged and managed and gently redirected. A woman who would pick up her fork because she was confused rather than because she was thinking. Let them think that. I have spent 34 years in rooms where the most important information was the information people didn't know they were giving you. I know what it looks like when someone believes they are the only one in the room doing the thinking. There is a particular quality of relaxation to it, something that loosens in the shoulders and the jaw. I watched it move through both of them as the dinner continued. Renata actually ate eventually, I noticed. Helped herself to the bread I had baked. Made no further comment on the food, and with every minute that I sat there quietly, I felt them settle more completely into the assumption that I had absorbed the blow and forgotten it. I had not forgotten it. I was not going to forget it. But the most dangerous moment in a long story is rarely the loudest one. The dinner table, the pushed plate, the 4 soft words from a husband who didn't raise his voice. None of that was the crisis. The crisis had been happening long before Renata ever pushed that plate. What happened that Sunday was simply the moment the crisis stopped hiding from me. And there is a kind of mercy in that, even when it doesn't feel like one. You know the feeling, perhaps, when something you have been half-knowing finally becomes whole. When the thing you have been finding reasons not to believe arrives so plainly that reasons are no longer possible. It doesn't feel like revelation. It feels like the moment after a long sound stops. Not relief, not pain, just the sudden quiet fact of it. I finished my dinner. I thanked Renata for coming. I cleared the plates. I put the leftover short rib in a container in the refrigerator, and I washed the linen napkins by hand, the way they have to be done, and I set them to dry on the rack by the laundry room window. And I started, very quietly, to plan. Before I go any further, I want to say something directly to you. The person watching this right now, wherever you are, this is my story. These are my words, my memories, my experience as I lived it. The names have been changed. Gerald, Renata, all of them. Because some of these people are still out there living their lives, and because this was never about punishment. It was about survival, and then about something quieter and harder to name than survival. It was about finally deciding that my own clarity was worth more than everyone else's comfort. I am sharing this because I spent a very long time believing that keeping the peace was the same thing as being a good wife, a good woman, a good person. I was not a passive woman by nature. Anyone who worked alongside me in 34 years of hotel management would tell you that. And yet somehow, inside my own home, I had learned to make myself smaller in increments so gradual, I barely registered each one. That is not weakness. I want to say that plainly. That is what happens when someone you trust, works very slowly and very quietly to rearrange the furniture of your life until you no longer recognize the room. I do not think I am the only one. If you have ever sat at your own table and been made to feel like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, if you have ever been spoken over, managed, handled, quietly revised, I think you already know exactly what I mean. And I think some part of you has been waiting for someone to say it out loud, so before we go any further, drop your city or country in the comments below. Just that. Let me know you're there. And if you're willing, tell me, has anyone ever made you feel small at your own table? You don't have to say more than that. I'll understand. I read every comment, every single one. And this community, the people who have found their way to these stories, they see you too. Now you know how it ended. You watched me sit there at that candlelit table, fork in hand, something permanently shifted behind my eyes. But you don't yet know how long the road was, or how far back it actually began. Let me tell you how we got there. I should tell you who I was before any of this happened. Not to make you feel sorry for me. I am not interested in your sympathy, only your understanding, but because who I was before matters enormously to what I was able to do when the time came. I started in hospitality at 23 years old, as a banquet assistant at a mid-sized hotel in the city where I grew up. It was not glamorous work. It was early mornings and late evenings, and learning which linen supplier would actually deliver on time, and which one would call at 4 in the afternoon with an apology and an excuse. It was learning to read a room before you walked fully into it, to assess, in the seconds between the door and your first step, whether the energy was right, whether someone at the head table was unhappy, whether the bar was moving too fast or too slow, and what that meant for the next 2 hours. It was, in other words, a 34-year education in paying attention. By the time I was in my early 40s, I was managing food and beverage operations for a regional chain. 6 properties, 40-something staff depending on the season. A budget that required the kind of vigilance that becomes second nature after enough years. I was not the kind of manager who sat in the office with the door closed. I walked floors. I tasted food before service. I read invoices myself rather than simply signing what was handed to me, because I had learned early that the discrepancies people assume will go unnoticed are almost always in the documents. Numbers, like people, tend to tell the truth eventually. You simply have to be willing to look at them long enough. I retired at 58, which felt early to some people and felt right to me. Gerald and I had the house. We had our savings. We had plans that had been discussed over many dinners and mapped out with the particular pleasure of 2 people who have been building something together for a long time. He was an engineer, structural, bridges, and load-bearing things. A man who thought in tolerances and force distribution. We used to joke that I built the rooms and he built the walls, and somewhere in the middle we'd managed to build a life. That joke was not original, but it was ours. And for a long time it was true. The Sunday dinners were Gerald's idea originally. Early in our marriage, when we were both still working long hours, and the weeks had a way of disappearing into themselves, he suggested we protect one meal, just one, every week, that we didn't eat standing at the counter or in front of the news or with our minds already halfway to Emerald a Monday. A proper table. A cooked meal. Nowhere to be afterward. It sounds simple because it is simple. The things that hold a life together usually are. But we kept it for 31 years, which is not simple at all. 31 years of Sundays. Through the years when our daughter Diane was small and wanted to eat nothing but buttered noodles. Through Gerald's father's illness. And then my mother's. Through the quiet stretch in our early 50s when Diane had moved away. And the table felt larger than it used to. And we had to learn each other again without the structure of parenthood around us. We kept the dinners. We kept the table. The bowl came from my mother. She gave it to me the week before my wedding, not as a formal gift, not wrapped or presented with ceremony, but handed to me in her kitchen one afternoon while we were going over some last detail of the reception menu. She set it on the counter between us and said, simply, "I want you to have this." It was hand-painted, cream-colored with a border of small blue flowers, that she always called forget-me-nots, though I've since wondered if they were something else entirely. Her own mother had brought it from the old country, which in our family was a phrase that carried geography and history and a certain weight of survival, without ever specifying any of those things precisely. The paint was already worn in places when I received it. A small chip on the inner rim, the blue a little faded on one side where it had sat in a sunny window for years. I had it restored once, in my 40s, by a woman who specialized in ceramics. She told me the painting had been done by hand, probably in the early part of the last century, and that the imperfections were what made it valuable. I put it at the center of the table at every Sunday dinner for 31 years. Fruit in summer when the market was good. Bread rolls in winter. Sometimes simply empty, which sounds like an oversight, but was deliberate. An empty bowl in the center of a table is still a kind of promise. It had held salads and roasted vegetables, and once memorably, a small collection of pine cones that Diane had arranged there when she was 7, and which we'd left for 3 Sundays running, because Gerald said it looked festive, and Diane was so pleased with herself that neither of us had the heart to move them. My mother died 11 years ago. The bowl is the only thing of hers I use rather than preserve. That felt important to her, and it feels important to me. She was not a woman who believed in saving the good things for occasions that never quite arrived. Use the bowl, set the table, light the candles. The occasion is already here. Now, Renata, I want to be fair to the beginning of things, because fairness matters to me even when it complicates the story. Renata was not always what she became, or rather, she was always what she was. But the conditions that allowed it to cause real damage didn't exist for a long time. In the early years of my marriage, she was simply Gerald's younger sister, loud in the way of people who grew up having to compete for airspace in a large family, opinionated in the way of people who have never had their opinions seriously questioned, and competitive with me in ways that were so low-grade and consistent, I'd long since filed them under personality rather than threat. She would comment on the food at Sunday dinners, not always unkindly, but always with the authority of someone who considered herself the arbiter of whether a thing was done correctly. She had her own way of cooking the family recipes, which differed from mine in ways that were objectively minor and subjectively significant to her. She would rearrange things in my kitchen when she helped clean up, which she always did, and which I always quietly rearranged back the following morning. She was not cruel. That is what I want to be clear about. She was difficult in the way that some people are difficult, abrasive in their affections, competitive in their love, wearing in the way that requires management rather than response. I had managed more difficult proximities than Renata's, without breaking a sweat. In 34 years of hospitality, you encounter every variety of human behavior across the full spectrum, and you learn to calibrate your response accordingly. Renata required a certain amount of patient redirection, and a certain amount of benign inattention, and a certain amount of simply letting things pass that were not worth the energy of catching. I was good at that. I had always been good at that. Gerald adored her. This was not a problem for most of our marriage. He had a particular tenderness for her that I understood. She was his younger sister. She had been through a difficult divorce in her early 40s. She had never had children and had made a life that was independent, but not always easy. Gerald was the older brother, and he felt that in his bones. He would have done a great deal for her without being asked, and regularly did. I respected that about him. I did not mistake it for something it wasn't, or I thought I didn't. 8 months before that Sunday dinner, Renata moved. She had lived 2 hours away for most of the time I'd known her. Close enough for regular visits, far enough that the visits had natural limits. She had a social life there, a circle of friends, a routine that was hers. Then she retired, and she sold her apartment, and she moved to a town 20 minutes from our house. She told us both over the phone, cheerfully, that she wanted to be closer to family as she got older. Gerald was delighted. I want to be precise here, not concerned, exactly. Aware. The way you are aware when the weather shifts before you can see any outward sign of it. Something in the air pressure changes, and you notice, even if you can't yet say what you're noticing. Her visits went from occasional to regular, then from regular to frequent, then from frequent to something that began to feel, by the time of that Sunday dinner, like a rhythm that had been established without my participation. She knew what nights Gerald was usually home early. She knew which Sunday we had dinner early versus late. She texted him rather than me, which was a small thing, except that it hadn't always been that way. There had been a period early in our marriage when she and I had had our own communication, our own independent thread that didn't route through Gerald. That thread had gone quiet so gradually I hadn't registered its disappearance until I found myself thinking, one Tuesday afternoon, that I couldn't remember the last time Renata had contacted me directly about anything. I filed it away. That was the habit of 34 years. When something doesn't fit quite right, you don't throw it out, you put it somewhere you can find it again. My mind has always worked like a well-organized filing cabinet, which is not a poetic way to describe a mind, but is, I think, an accurate one. I didn't know then what I know now about why she moved closer. I didn't know about the debt, or the conversations she and Gerald had been having for the better part of that year, or the documents. I only knew that the table felt slightly different on the Sundays she joined us. That some quality of ease I'd always taken for granted had been replaced by something I couldn't name. Something that hummed at a frequency just below the reach of words. The bowl still sat at the center of the table. The candles were still lit. The meals were still good, because I am someone who makes good meals regardless of what is happening around me. That is not stubbornness. It is simply the only way I know how to be. But I was watching. Without knowing quite what I was watching for, I was watching. The first cracks did not arrive with drama. They arrived the way expensive things often break. With a hairline fault you only notice when the light catches it at the right angle. If I had not spent most of my adult life tracing problems backward from their smallest visible symptom, I might have missed them. But I had spent 34 years checking invoice against delivery slips, banquet counts against staffing rosters, guest complaints against kitchen logs, and that kind of work teaches you one enduring lesson. The obvious problem is almost never the first one. Gerald began doing something so subtle that, at first, I could almost admire the craftsmanship of it. On Sundays when Renata was due for dinner, he would drift into the kitchen while I was finishing a sauce, or taking the roast out to rest, lean one shoulder against the doorframe, and say things that sounded harmless until I held them still long enough to inspect them. If I had made lamb, he might say, "Renata has been having some stomach issues, so don't worry if she only picks." If I had spent the morning rolling pastry, he would tell me she had become very particular lately, and then, after a pause too small for anyone else to hear as deliberate, he would add, "Margaret's been tired, so just be kind." The first time I heard that, I actually laughed, because I thought he was clumsily defending me against a criticism that had not yet been made. The second time, I felt my shoulders tighten. By the fourth or fifth time, I understood what he was doing. He was lowering expectations before the meal had even reached the table, and he was doing it in my name. That is one of the crueler forms of disloyalty, I think, because it steals from you in advance. A rude comment at the table can be answered. A look can be challenged. But if someone has already framed you as fragile before the doorbell rings, then every raised eyebrow after that arrives in a room that has been prepared for it. Renata took to using the same language. Not always. Not enough to create a scene. Just enough that I noticed the echo. Margaret has had a lot on her mind. Margaret forgets things sometimes. Margaret overdoes it. It was always spoken with a brightness that made objection seem almost vulgar. Concern is one of the most efficient disguises there is, especially when it comes wrapped in family. If you have never been slowly managed by someone who says they love you, let me explain the texture of it. People talk about gaslighting as if it is always theatrical, as if someone stands in front of you and insists the blue cup in your hand is red. In my experience, real gaslighting inside a marriage is softer than that, and much more effective. It is a hand at the small of your back, steering you half an inch to the left, until after enough years you are no longer where you meant to stand. It is your husband asking, with a tenderness no decent woman wants to punish, whether you remembered to mail the card he already watched you mail. It is him repeating a detail you know you told him, then smiling faintly and saying, "Maybe you did, maybe I forgot. We both have our moments. It is not an assault, it is weather. And weather, if it lasts long enough, can reshape an entire coast." I started keeping notes, though at first I did not call them that. A date on the corner of a grocery list. a line in the small blue notebook I used for recipes and holiday menus. Gerald apologized for dinner before guests arrived. Renata referred to me as tired again. Gerald answered for me when Diane asked whether we were still coming for Thanksgiving. None of it looked significant alone. Together, it began to form a pattern, and pattern is what my mind trusts. The money came next. That is not exactly true, because the money had probably been moving before I noticed it, but in terms of my awareness, yes, the money came next. We had a joint savings account that sat a little apart from our day-to-day finances. It was not our primary checking account, not the one used for groceries and utilities and ordinary life. It was the account where larger reserves lived, the one we had built over years of disciplined habit, the one attached in my mind to roof repairs, medical emergencies, perhaps a long trip we might finally take when we felt like airports again. I rarely checked it, which was less careless than it sounds. We had never given each other reason to. Trust becomes a practical habit after enough decades. You stop testing the floor because it has held your weight for so long. One Wednesday morning, I logged in because I was looking for an old tax document and happened to notice the current balance. It was lower than I expected. Not dramatically lower. That is another reason I almost missed it. The amount was just wrong enough to prickle, but not wrong enough to alarm. I looked at the recent activity and found 2 transfers, each a little under $10,000, made 3 weeks apart to an account I did not recognize. No memo line. No note. Just an abbreviation and the last 4 digits. I remember the exact sensation in my hands then. Not shaking. My hands did not shake. They went very still, the way a server's hands go still when a tray begins to tilt. An instinct takes over before panic does. I checked again, thinking perhaps I had misread it. Then I printed the page, because paper has a way of clarifying what a screen tries to soften. When Gerald came home that evening, I waited until after dinner to ask. I did not accuse. I simply set the printed statement beside his plate and said, "Can you tell me what these 2 transfers are?" He looked at the paper, then at me, and I watched his face do a small, swift calculation. There are expressions most people miss because they pass so quickly. Hospitality taught me not to miss them. Surprise first, then caution, then offense, not because offense was true, but because offense is often the fastest way to regain control of a conversation. "Oh, that," he said. He tapped the paper with one finger. That was just a temporary thing for Renata. She was moving money around when she bought the condo, and I helped her bridge some timing issue. "I thought I told you." "Maybe you did," I said, softened immediately. That was the part that chilled me, how quickly he softened once I gave him the easier road. "Sweetheart, you've had so much on your mind lately. I probably mentioned it when you were distracted. I didn't want to burden you with details." There it was again. Not a lie, standing upright in the middle of the room where anyone could point to it. A lie draped over concern like a tablecloth, something decorative meant to hide the shape underneath. I asked why the money had come from our savings rather than his discretionary account. He smiled, opened the refrigerator, took out a bottle of sparkling water, and answered over his shoulder. "It was simpler," he said. "All of it's ours anyway. All of it's ours anyway." That is a sentence I heard differently after that evening. Before, it would have sounded marital, practical, ordinary. After, it sounded territorial, possessive in a way that erased me while pretending to include me. I did not argue. I nodded. Then I washed the dishes and wrote the date in my blue notebook. The phrase family planning meetings entered our life not long after that. Gerald used it casually the first time, so casually, I might have overlooked it if I had not already been listening differently. He came home on a Thursday smelling faintly of coffee and rain, set his keys on the hall table, and said he had been delayed because he and Renata had a family planning meeting. I was rinsing lettuce at the sink. I turned off the water and asked, "A planning meeting for what?" He bent to unlace his shoes and said, "Nothing major, just talking through some future stuff, making sure everyone's protected." Everyone, I remember thinking, is an interesting word when you only invited one person. I asked why I had not known about it beforehand. He straightened up, gave me a small, tired smile, and said he hadn't wanted to drag me into detail until they had something concrete. When I said that most family matters involving our finances did, in fact, already involve me, he kissed my cheek. That was all. a kiss on the cheek, and a murmur that we would go over everything later. The gesture was tender enough that objecting would have required me to look hard, so I looked hard. There were more meetings after that, not every week. That would have been sloppy. Just often enough to establish momentum. Lunches, coffee appointments. One Saturday morning errand that took 4 hours and returned with no groceries, no receipts, and a vague explanation about traffic. If I asked what had been discussed, Gerald offered soft, dissolving answers: estate matters, family concerns, future-proofing, sensible conversations, nothing to upset yourself about. Nothing to upset yourself about. That phrase belongs in the same museum as "you're overreacting" and "I was only trying to help." A whole gallery of language designed to make a woman feel unreasonable for wanting a clear accounting of her own life. I did something then that I am almost embarrassed to admit, though perhaps many of you will understand it immediately. I began auditing myself. Not just them, myself. I checked the calendar to make sure I had remembered dates correctly. I looked back through my text messages to confirm conversations I knew had happened. I started leaving myself little anchors around the house, not because I believed I was declining, but because I wanted proof in the event that anyone suggested I was. A note in my purse before I went to the pharmacy. A photograph of the electric bill after I paid it. A voice memo after a phone call. Diane invited us for Thanksgiving at 2:15. Gerald was standing in the kitchen when she asked. This is one of the quieter violences of that kind of manipulation. It recruits your own good faith against you. Because you are honest, you entertain the possibility that you are mistaken. Because you are decent, you examine yourself before accusing others. Because you love the person speaking, you grant them a credibility a stranger would never receive. There is no virtue more exploitable than a fair-minded woman, and yet the self-auditing helped me, though not in the way they would have hoped. Every check I made strengthened my confidence. The dates were right, the bills were paid, the cards were mailed, the conversations had happened as I remembered them. If anything, I discovered that my memory was sharper than Gerald's in almost every instance. He forgot birthdays, appointments, the names of neighbors he had known for 10 years. I did not seize on that. I am not interested in humiliating a man for ordinary aging. We were both in our 60s. We both misplaced reading glasses and forgot why we had come into a room from time to time. That was not the issue. The issue was not forgetfulness. The issue was that his forgetfulness was treated as humanity, while mine was being curated into a narrative. One evening Diane called while Gerald was in the den with the television too loud. She asked lightly whether Dad was all right. I remember drying a wine glass while I held the phone and asking what she meant. She hesitated, then said he had been sounding strange lately, overly reassuring in a way that made her uneasy. He kept telling her I needed rest. He mentioned, twice in one conversation, that I was slowing down a bit. Diane said it gently because she loves her father, but I heard the edge under her voice. Diane has always had that gift. She can sound calm while laying a ruler along the crooked part of a story. I told her I was fine. I did not tell her everything because I did not yet know everything, and I have never believed in alarming a daughter before I have facts in my hand. But after we hung up, I stood in the kitchen for a long moment with the dish towel in my hands and understood that whatever story Gerald and Renata were building, it was no longer contained inside our house. They were rehearsing it elsewhere, trying on the lines, seeing which version sounded natural. That realization altered me more than the money had. Money can be restored, or at least accounted for. A reputation, once loosened from its moorings inside a family, drifts very quickly. All it takes is a few well-placed comments delivered with reluctant concern. She's been overwhelmed. She's not quite herself. We are just trying to help. People believe such things because they want to believe they would recognize cruelty if it arrived openly, and because open cruelty is easier to resist than carrying control. I started noticing how often Gerald answered questions I had not directed to him. At the pharmacy counter, when the young clerk asked whether I still wanted the 90-day refill, Gerald said, "Yes, that's easiest for her." When our accountant called about an annual review, Gerald took the call in his office and later summarized it for me in 3 broad sentences. When Diane asked over speakerphone whether I had seen the cottage rental she sent for spring, Gerald chuckled and said, Your mother has enough on her plate right now. None of these moments would convict anyone by themselves. Together they formed a trail, not blood on the carpet, dust on a shoe, a moved chair, an ash where no one admits smoking. Evidence that requires patience rather than passion. Patience, luckily I had, the Tuesday my neighbor spoke to me. I had just come back from book club with a paperback in my handbag, and half a thought about whether I had enough cream for the next morning's coffee. It was one of those ordinary late afternoons that feel too plain to hide anything significant. The sun was low. Someone on the next street was cutting grass. Mrs. Alvarez from across the way was watering the geraniums on her porch, still in the floral apron she seemed to wear over every outfit she owned. Mrs. Alvarez had lived on our street for 20 years and possessed the gift, common to excellent concierges, of seeing more than she commented on. She was not a gossip. That distinction matters. A gossip collects information for pleasure. Mrs. Alvarez held information the way careful people hold breakable dishes, and if she offered it, there was usually a reason. She called my name as I was taking my mail from the box. Margaret, sweetheart, did you get your locks fixed? I looked up and asked what she meant. She came down the steps from her porch slowly, watering can still in one hand, and said she did not want to interfere. But she'd seen Gerald's sister letting herself into our house that afternoon. Around 2 o'clock, she thought. Maybe a little after. She had assumed Gerald was home, or that I had sent Renata for something, but when she saw Renata leave, 40 minutes later carrying nothing, and looking over her shoulder before she shut the door, it struck her as odd. I remember every sound around me stopping. Not literally, of course. The mower was still going. A dog barked somewhere beyond the hedges. But inside me, something went silent and precise. I asked, very evenly, "Are you sure it was her key?" Mrs. Alvarez nodded. "She unlocked the deadbolt herself," she said. "I could see it from my porch." Gerald had given Renata a key to my house, and I had learned it from the woman across the street. Not from my husband. Not from a conversation. Not from any trust he claimed to be protecting. From my neighbor, standing in an apron with a watering can, looking embarrassed to be the one telling me. I thanked her, walked inside, set my book on the table, and knew I would not ask Gerald a question until I had proof. Once Mrs. Alvarez told me about the key, I stopped asking myself whether I was imagining things and started asking better questions. Not what if, not am I overreacting. Who knew what, when did they know it, and how far had they already gone? Those are the questions operations people ask when an inventory problem turns out not to be an inventory problem at all, but a habit someone thought nobody would audit. I did not sleep much that night. Gerald slept beside me with the heavy, uncomplicated breathing of a man who believed the floor beneath him was solid. I lay awake, listening to the house settle around us, and made a plan so simple it almost embarrassed me. If Renata was using that key when she believed I was out, then all I had to do was be out where I was expected to be, and not out at all. On Thursday morning, I told Gerald I was meeting 2 former colleagues for a late lunch and then driving across town to look at a lamp Diane had found for me at an antique shop. It was ordinary enough to be believed and boring enough not to invite further questions. He nodded over his coffee, asked whether I wanted him to come with me. And when I said no, he smiled in that careful way he had lately adopted, half fondness and half assessment. "Maybe that would be good," he said. "Get you out for a bit." I remember thinking, with a steadiness that surprised me, that he was auditioning lines now, trying out the language of management until it fit him naturally. I smiled back, asked if he wanted more toast, and watched him relax. People show more when they think a conversation has gone their way. I left the house at 11 with my handbag, my library book, and the kind of face a woman wears when she intends to spend an afternoon doing harmless things. I drove to the shopping center on the edge of town, parked near the garden store, waited 10 minutes in full view of anyone who might have followed me by chance, then pulled back out and drove the long way home through the older neighborhood with the sycamores. I parked 3 streets over beside the park, switched off the engine, and sat for a moment with my hands resting on the wheel. I was not frightened then. That came later, and even then it was not the sort that makes you run. What I felt in that car was the cold, clean focus I used to feel before walking into a banquet kitchen when I already knew. From the expression on the night manager's face, that something had gone wrong and I would need to find it before service began. Our side gate had needed oiling for months, so I did not use it. I came around through the back hedge where the fence line dips a little near the hydrangeas, stepped over the border stones, and reached the kitchen door without a sound. Hospitality teaches you how to move in public spaces quietly. You learn which floorboards announce themselves, which latch catches if you turn it too quickly, how to cross a room while people remain occupied with their own assumptions. The kitchen was empty, no music, no kettle, no purse on the counter, but there was a smell I had not expected, a sharp floral perfume that Renata wore too heavily in every season. I stood still long enough to hear the house. One of the oldest instincts I have is listening for the rhythm of a building when other people are inside it. A cupboard closing on the second floor sounds different from a drawer on the first. A person moving carefully sounds different from someone who believes they are alone. I heard movement down the hall, then the soft electronic chirp of a phone camera. Gerald's office was at the front of the house, a room that had once been our den until his retirement gradually colonized it into leather chairs, bridge manuals, stacked folders, and an expensive desk he said would help him feel organized. The door was not fully closed. It stood open by perhaps 3 inches, enough for a thin line I'd light across the runner in the hall. I moved toward it and looked in. Renata was standing at his desk with her reading glasses low on her nose, holding her phone over a spread of papers and taking photographs one page at a time. She was not rifling or rummaging. That would have looked almost innocent by comparison. She was methodical. Lift page, flatten corner, photograph, turn, photograph again if the first image had glare. There is something chilling about competence used in service of betrayal. Had she looked panicked or clumsy, I might have felt outrage first. But what I felt was colder than outrage. I felt confirmation. I did not step into the room. I did not clear my throat or demand an explanation. I stayed in the hallway, partly because I did not yet know enough, and partly because some old operational instinct had already taken control of me. When a theft problem surfaces in a hotel, you do not announce yourself at the first missing bottle of liquor. You watch. You let the pattern expose itself. Renata set the phone down, picked up one of the pages, and murmured under her breath, "Come on, Gerald, you should have signed this one already." A second later, her phone rang in her hand. She glanced at the screen, answered at once, and put it on speaker while continuing to sort the papers. I did not hear Gerald's first words clearly, but I heard hers. I heard every one of them. "The timeline needs to move," she said, not loudly, not urgently. In a business-like tone, the kind people use when discussing paint samples or travel dates. She flipped the paper page, took another photograph. "No, listen to me," she said after a pause. "If you keep waiting for some perfect moment, you'll still be talking in circles by Christmas." She already doubts herself. That was the sentence that seemed to alter the air pressure in the hall. She already doubts herself. Then came the one that followed it, and that was the one that took the last of my uncertainty away. She won't contest it if she thinks it's her idea. I remember my hand against the wall, the cool paint under my palm. I remember the absurd detail of a loose thread at the hem of the runner. I remember understanding, with a clarity so sharp it almost felt impersonal, that I was no longer listening to vague disloyalty or ordinary family meddling. I was hearing structure, design, architecture. Gerald must have said something then, because Renata laughed once, short and dismissive. She told him I was easier to steer when he sounded worried rather than firm. She said he needed to stop over-explaining because too much detail made people suspicious. People, not me, people, as if I had already been moved from the category of equal partner into the category of case study. As if my mind were not the one she was discussing, but a condition she and Gerald were jointly managing from a safe distance. She asked whether the lawyer had revised the incapacity language. She said the old version sounded harsh. He must have answered yes, because she said, good, that's better," then added that if they framed it as protection and future planning, Diane would probably stay out of it. That was when my heartbeat changed. Until then I had felt almost detached, all observation and record. The mention of my daughter brought blood back into the scene. I had not yet spoken to Diane because I was waiting for facts. Hearing her name in Renata's mouth like that, as an obstacle to be calculated around, made me bite the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste metal. The call lasted maybe 3 more minutes. Long enough for Renata to say she would handle the photos, and that Gerald needed to delete one email chain because he had left too many comments in the margins. Long enough for her to ask whether he had scheduled the doctor conversation yet, then correct herself and say, "No, not like that, not a doctor conversation, just something to put on the record." That phrase lodged in me, something to put on the record. In operations, we used to say that when we wanted documentation to support a decision already made, we did not seek the truth and then record it. We recorded selectively until the truth looked inevitable. By the time she ended the call, I knew 3 things with certainty. First, there were documents. Second, there was a lawyer. Third, my husband and his sisters were trying to build a paper trail that would allow them to call me incapable without ever needing me actually to be incapable. That was the moment the house changed for me. I had lived in it for 31 years. In that hallway, listening to the sister of my husband discuss how best to curate my decline, it ceased to feel entirely like mine. I heard a chair scrape. I stepped back into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator, just as Renata came down the hall. She saw me with the milk carton in my hand, and startled so visibly that, for one brief second, I saw the naked shape of her fear before she dressed it. "Margaret," she said, pressing her hand to her chest, "you nearly gave me a heart attack." I kept my voice mild and asked what she was doing there. She answered too quickly. "Gerald asked me to pick up some paperwork for him. He said it was fine if I let myself in." I nodded, took out the milk, and asked whether she wanted coffee. She said no, she was in a rush, then added that she had knocked and assumed I was still out. Still out. The phrase confirmed more than she knew. I said I had come back early because the antique shop was closed. Another lie offered in a polite tone. We stood facing each other in my kitchen, both pretending the afternoon was ordinary. And I realized that she was not worried I had seen the papers. She was worried I might start asking precise questions, so I asked none. After she left, I waited 5 full minutes before going into Gerald's office. Waiting matters when you need your own mind to stay ahead of your emotions. The room smelled faintly of dust, printer toner, and Renata's perfume. There were no papers on the desk. That disappointed me for exactly 2 seconds, until I noticed the tray of the printer was slightly ajar. Inside it, tucked beneath a packet of engineering newsletters, were 3 pages she must have missed when she gathered the rest. A cover letter from a law office I did not recognize, an unsigned draft titled Amendment to Revocable Trust, and a sheet of notes in Gerald's handwriting, the small compressed script he used when he was trying to fit more onto a page than the page could reasonably hold. I read standing up, which I do not recommend when the ground beneath your understanding is about to shift. The words were dry, legal, almost bored with themselves, successor authority, capacity review, co-trustee, protective oversight. Renata's full legal name appeared halfway down the 2nd page. My own name appeared 4 times above it. I did not take it. I photographed them with my own phone, front and back, including the law office letterhead and the date. Then I put them back exactly where I had found them and closed the printer tray, with the same slight misalignment. People who hide things often notice when the hidden thing has been touched, even if they cannot say how they know. I was not going to give them that advantage. The rest of the afternoon passed with an eerie normality. I folded laundry. I watered the basil on the windowsill. At 4:20, Gerald called to say he might be late because traffic was ugly near the interstate. His voice was so ordinary that I nearly admired it. I told him I understood. I asked whether he wanted chicken or salmon for dinner. He said, "Whatever is easiest for you, sweetheart." There was that word again, sweetheart, soft as brushed cotton, covering everything it touched. When I hung up, I looked at my call log as if it might reveal a second conversation running beneath the first, some hidden current of meaning, only now made visible. There was nothing, of course, just timestamps. Evidence is often disappointingly plain. That evening I served dinner at 6:30. Chicken, as it happened, because I wanted the comfort of a task I could complete well. Gerald ate with appetite. He asked whether I had found the lamp. He told me a mildly funny story about a man at the hardware store, returning the wrong size screws. He looked at me across the table with the same face I had trusted for more than 3 decades. I answered where answers were required, smiled where smiling cost me nothing, and noticed that he never once mentioned seeing Renata that afternoon. Not once. It was not a sin born of distraction, it was a deliberate absence, and deliberate absences have shape if you are trained to see them. After dinner, he went to shower. I cleared the plates, loaded the dishwasher, wiped the counters, and waited until I heard the bathroom fan come on upstairs. Then I dried my hands and walked into his office. Gerald is not a man who ever imagined I would go through his email. That is not because he thought especially well of me. It is because he had sorted me into a category that no longer required vigilance. Wives who smooth napkins and remember birthdays and ask whether anyone wants more tea are often mistaken for women who do not know how to investigate. He had set up our home computer years earlier, and he had been practical, not clever, about passwords. One of the old bridge terms he loved, followed by the year Diane graduated college. I sat at his desk, typed it in once, and his inbox opened like a mouth. I searched Renata first, then estate, then trust. The volume was not enormous. That told me this was newer than I had feared, or at least sloppier. There were threads with an attorney named Philip Sloan, from a firm across town I had never heard Gerald mention. There were forwarded attachments, scheduling notes, and one email from Gerald that made me sit back in the chair and close my eyes for a moment before reading it again. "We need language that preserves dignity," he had written, "but also gives Renata authority if Margaret's confusion worsens." Her confusion. Not a hypothetical decline, not a standard contingency for both spouses equally, mine, framed as a process already underway. Another message from Sloan attached the newest draft, and thanked Gerald for clarifying that Mrs. Turner had been increasingly forgetful, increasingly and resistant to assistance. I had to press 2 fingers against my wrist then, not because I might faint, but because anger can raise its own pulse to a dangerous speed if you let it. The draft itself was attached as a PDF and as an editable document. That mattered. An attached final version would have meant they were near the end. An editable one meant the thing was still being shaped, which meant I still had room. I opened it. It named our house, our investment account, and the savings account I had questioned. It stated that in the event of my cognitive incapacity, temporary or permanent, Gerald would remain primary trustee and could appoint an assisting co-trustee for the efficient management of marital assets. The proposed co-trustee was Renata Bell. A note in the margin from Gerald read, "Maybe broaden trigger language so we don't need formal diagnosis immediately." Another note from the lawyer suggested replacing obvious incapacity with diminished executive function observed by spouse and corroborated by family concern. Corroborated by family concern. That was how little they needed to move a woman from person to problem. Not a court, not a doctor. Concern. I read the clause 3 times, then printed the entire chain, each page sliding warm into the tray, as if the machine itself were quietly joining my side. I cleaned the printer history, closed the inbox, and returned everything to the way he had left it, down to the angle of the mouse pad and the pen across his blotter. Then I carried the papers I had printed to the kitchen. Not because it was the safest room, but because it was the truest one. The house was dark by then except for the light over the stove. Gerald was still upstairs. Water moved in the pipes behind the wall. I set my mother's painted serving bowl in the center of the table without knowing why, then sat down beside it with the document spread in a neat stack. Blue flowers around the rim, the chip on the inside edge. 31 years of meals, holidays, apologies, laughter, recovery, habit. 31 years of believing the table was the center of our life when it had become the stage where I was being rewritten. I did not rage. Rage would have been easier. Easier to spend and easier for them to predict. I sat still, one hand on the page, and began to think not about how to confront them, but how to make sure they would have nowhere to hide when I did. That night I slept beside Gerald, with his papers folded inside my robe pocket, and my heart beating so steadily it almost frightened me. I had expected insomnia, racing thoughts, the kind of restlessness that follows discovery. Instead, I felt something closer to calm, though calm is not quite the right word. Operational stillness. The state you enter when a crisis has finally declared itself and the only thing left is response. Panic belongs to the phase before you know what you are dealing with. Once you know, panic becomes a luxury you cannot afford. I lay in the dark listening to Gerald breathe, and understood that the woman beside him was no longer the woman he believed her to be. That asymmetry was the only advantage I had. I was not going to waste it on a confrontation that would feel satisfying for 5 minutes and cost me everything after. In the morning, I made coffee the way I always did. I asked Gerald whether he wanted eggs or just toast. He said just toast, sat at the table reading something on his phone, and thanked me when I set the plate in front of him. The ordinariness of it was almost unbearable. Not because I wanted drama, but because I now understood that ordinariness had been the costume all along. Every familiar gesture, every morning routine, every quiet Sunday we had shared for 31 years had been running on an agreement I thought we both honored. He had stopped honoring it months ago, perhaps longer, and I had continued to perform my half of the marriage as if the other half still existed. That is the strange grief of betrayal inside a long partnership. You mourn not only what was taken, but what you were still giving while it was being taken. I did not confront him that morning. I did not confront him the next day, or the day after that, or at any point in the week that followed. This was not passivity. I need you to understand that. A woman who has spent 3 decades managing hotel operations knows the difference between inaction and strategic delay. When a staffing problem or a vendor fraud surfaces, you do not call a meeting in the first hour and announce everything you suspect. You let the pattern develop. You document. You wait until your evidence is heavy enough that no one can wave it away with a plausible excuse or a wounded expression. Confrontation is not strength. Confrontation is simply the moment when you have decided the information you possess is worth more exposed than concealed. I had not reached that moment yet. I needed help. I needed a witness. And I needed time to think in a room where no one was watching me think. On Monday afternoon, I called Claire Ashford. Claire was an attorney I had met 15 years earlier through a hospitality association luncheon, where she had given a talk on liability concerns for event venues. We had stayed in touch loosely, the way professional women sometimes do, exchanging holiday cards and occasional lunches that never quite became a close friendship, but never faded entirely either. More importantly, she had handled a small estate matter for me when my mother passed, and I had retained her informally for anything that might arise afterward. She was not a family lawyer or a trust specialist in the strictest sense, but she had a network, and she had something more valuable to me in that moment. She was entirely outside the circle Gerald and Renata had drawn. I called her from the parking lot of the library, sitting in my car with the windows up. I told her I needed to see her soon, that it was not an emergency in the legal sense, but that I would be grateful for her time. She asked whether everything was all right. I said I was not sure yet and that I would explain when I saw her. We agreed to meet Wednesday for coffee at a place near her office, a small bakery that served the kind of complicated pastries neither of us ever ordered, but that provided a reason to sit for an hour without attracting attention. I did not want to meet at her office. Offices leave records, sign-in sheets, the memory of a receptionist who might later be asked who came in that week. A bakery is just 2 women catching up. No one remembers 2 women catching up. On Wednesday, I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table near the back where the acoustics were poor and the espresso machine was loud. Claire came in wearing a gray coat and the kind of reading glasses she always pushed up into her hair when she was not using them. She hugged me briefly, ordered a tea, and sat down with the particular attentiveness I remembered from our previous conversations. Claire was a woman who listened with her whole face, and that quality had made me trust her years before I had anything significant to trust her with. I told her everything, not dramatically, not out of order, not with the emotional emphasis I might have used with a friend. I told her the way I would have told a general manager about a serious incident: dates, documents, names, observations. I showed her the photographs I had taken of the trust amendment draft. I showed her the printouts from Gerald's email. I described the phone call I had overheard between Renata and Gerald, including the phrases I had memorized because some sentences burn themselves into you, whether you want them to or not. She won't contest it if she thinks it's her idea. She already tout herself. Claire listened without interrupting. When I finished, she set her tea down and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. She He confirmed what I had already suspected but needed to hear from someone with legal training. If the amendment were executed as drafted, it would create a mechanism for removing my authority over jointly held assets without my consent, triggered not by a medical diagnosis, but by a looser standard that Gerald and Renata could satisfy themselves with minimal outside scrutiny. The language about family concern as corroboration was particularly troubling, she said, because it meant Renata's involvement was not incidental. She was being written into the structure as both witness and beneficiary. That combination, Claire said, should concern any court that looked at it closely. But courts only looked closely when someone raised an objection, and the entire design seemed intended to prevent me from objecting in time. She asked whether I wanted to confront Gerald now or whether I wanted to build a stronger position first. I said I wanted to build. She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when the answer does not surprise them, but they needed to hear it spoken aloud. She told me she would refer me to a colleague who specialized in trust litigation, someone who could review the documents with an eye toward what we would need if this ever reached a formal challenge. She also suggested I begin creating my own documentation of competence, not because I was incompetent, but because the amendment's language depended on a narrative of decline that I could preemptively contradict. Doctors' visits with notes confirming cognitive health, dated emails and texts showing clear reasoning, financial records showing I was still managing accounts and paying bills without confusion. The goal, she said, was to make their story look ridiculous before they ever had the chance to tell it. We talked for another 40 minutes. When I left the bakery, I sat in my car again for a while, watching people walk past with their shopping bags and their ordinary afternoons. I thought about how many women might be sitting in parking lots at that exact moment, holding information they did not yet know how to use. That thought did not make me feel less alone, but it made me feel less surprised. Loneliness is easier when you stop expecting it to be otherwise. That evening, I called Diane. She answered on the third ring, sounding slightly out of breath because she had been on a walk with the dog when her phone buzzed. I could hear the wind in the background, the jingle of the leash clip, the particular rhythm of her footsteps on pavement. For a moment, I wanted to say nothing, to let her keep walking in a world where her father was still the man she had always believed him to be. But I had already decided that protecting her from knowledge was not the same as protecting her. She needed to know enough to be alert, even if she did not yet need to know everything. I told her I was fine, first, because mothers learn to lead with that when the subject is difficult. Then I told her I had discovered some things about your father and Renata that concern me, and I want you to be aware without being alarmed. I heard her footsteps stop. The wind kept moving, but she did not. She asked what kind of things. I said carefully that there were financial and legal matters being discussed without my involvement, and that some of the language being used suggested an effort to limit my authority over shared assets. I did not use the word betrayal. I did not say anything that would force her to choose a side before she had seen evidence herself. I simply told her that I was taking steps to protect myself, that I had consulted a lawyer, and that I wanted her to ruin in case anyone tried to tell her a different version of events. Deanne was quiet for a long time. She has always processed information slowly and thoroughly, turning it over before she reacts, a quality she did not inherit from Gerald. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but not calm. She asked whether Dad knew I had found out. I said no. She asked whether I was safe. I said yes because I believed I was, and because what I was facing was not the kind of danger that announces itself with violence. The danger here was procedural, administrative, quiet. The danger was waking up one morning to discover that the papers had already been signed and the definitions had already been applied, and the woman I had been was now officially a problem to be managed rather than a person with her own will. I told Diane I would keep her informed, but that I needed her to do something for me first. I needed her not to confront her father yet, not to ask leading questions or behave differently when she called him, not to give any indication that the conversation had changed. She resisted at first, the way daughters resist when they want to protect their mothers, and do not yet understand that protection sometimes looks like patience. I told her, gently, that I had more experience than she did in managing situations where the other party did not know what I knew. I told her I needed room to operate. She agreed reluctantly, and I heard in her reluctance how much she loved me. We hung up after a few more minutes of smaller talk, the kind of conversation that exists to soften the edges of a harder one. When I set the phone down, I felt something shift in my chest, a heaviness that was not quite grief and not quite relief. Telling Diane had made it real in a way the documents had not. Evidence can be misread, denied, explained away. But saying the words out loud to my daughter meant I could no longer pretend, even to myself, that I might be wrong. Sunday came the way Sundays always did. I woke early, made a list, drove to the market, selected vegetables and bread, and the lamb Gerald had always claimed was his favorite. I set the table the way I had set it for 31 years, linen cloth smoothed twice, corners hanging evenly, my mother's painted bowl at the center, holding nothing but the light from the window. Gerald came downstairs around noon and said the house smelled wonderful. Renata arrived at 1:30, let herself in with the key I now knew she had, and looked at the table with that familiar assessing glance I had once mistaken for mere opinion. I served them both. I smiled where smiling was expected. I accepted compliments on the lamb without flinching and answered Renata's questions about my week with the pleasant vagueness of a woman who had nothing to hide. They believed me, I think. They believed me because they had already decided that what I was, and people rarely look closely at something. They believe they understand. They did not know that Claire's colleague had already received the documents. They did not know that Diane was watching now quietly from 2 states away. They did not know that I had begun keeping a dated log of every interaction, every comment, every email, building a counter-narrative so detailed that their version would look like a sketch beside it. Let them build their trap. I would let them believe it was working. And while they were busy underestimating me, I would take it apart from the inside, piece by piece, until there was nothing left for them to spring. The performance began the morning after that Sunday dinner, and it did not stop for 6 weeks. I want you to understand what that means. Not in the abstract, but in the specific daily texture of living inside a role you have written for yourself, while the people around you believe they are the ones holding the script. It is exhausting in a way that does not show on the body. It is the kind of tired that lives behind the eyes, in the space where your real thoughts run parallel to the ones you are pretending to have. I had trained hospitality staff for decades to manage difficult guests with invisible effort, to smile through complaints and technically wrong customers, and the particular rudeness people who believe service workers do not have interior lives. I had never expected to use those skills in my own kitchen, on my own husband, for my own survival. But skills do not care why you need them. They only care whether you are willing to use them. I started small. A question here, a hesitation there. Gerald, did I already pay the electric bill this month? I think I did, but I cannot quite remember. He would answer patiently, sometimes checking his phone, sometimes simply reassuring me that yes, I had paid it. I had told him so on Thursday. I thanked him each time with a slight furrowing of the brow, as if the confirmation relieved a genuine worry. What he did not know was that I had already documented the payment, the date, and the confirmation number in a notebook I kept in my handbag. Every time he reassured me, I logged his reassurance. Not because I needed proof of the bill itself, but because I was building a record of my own consistent competence reflected back through his own words. If his story later became that I had been declining for months, the record would show that he had repeatedly confirmed I was functioning fine. People rarely realize they are being documented by someone they have already categorized as confused. Confusion, in their minds, precludes strategy. I asked him to remind me of appointments I had already written down. I asked him whether Diane had called on Tuesday or Wednesday, when I knew perfectly well it had been Tuesday at 6:15. I asked him, once, whether we were out of milk, then opened the refrigerator and pretended to be surprised to see the full carton I had bought that morning. He smiled at that one, a small tight smile that did not reach his eyes, and said maybe I had forgotten buying it. I agreed that maybe I had. I watched him store that moment somewhere in his mind, another data point for a diagnosis he was building without my consent. Let him store it. I was storing it too, in a different file, for a different purpose. Renata came for dinner twice more during those weeks, and both times I was warm and gracious in a way that required more self-control than I cared to admit. The first dinner was a roast chicken, simple and well executed, served with roasted potatoes, and a green salad dressed at the last moment. Renata commented on the chicken being slightly dry, which it was not, and Gerald murmured something about how I had been distracted lately. I apologized and offered her more salad. She accepted, looking satisfied, and I thought about how easy it is to become the villain in someone else's story when that person needs you to be one. She did not hate me, not exactly. I was simply in the way of something she wanted, and people are remarkably flexible in how they characterize obstacles. What she did not realize was that I had learned, over the years, how to extract information from people who believed they were managing me. The trick is to make yourself smaller than you are, to ask questions that sound naive, to let the other person feel like the expert. Renata loved feeling like the expert. Over the course of those dinners, I gathered more from her unguarded comments than I had gathered from all my searching before. It started with a casual question about her new condo, whether she was happy with it, whether the mortgage had closed smoothly. She sighed and said the closing had been a nightmare, that the rates were terrible right now, and that she was still sorting out some old debts from before the move. I expressed sympathy. She expanded, complaining about credit card balances that had somehow gotten away from her, about the cost of living alone, about how unfair it was that some people had family money to fall back on, and others had to scrape by. I nodded and said nothing about the nearly $20,000 that had moved from our savings account to an account I now knew was connected to her. She did not seem to realize the irony. Or perhaps she simply believed that money transferred between family members was not really a debt, just a different kind of belonging. The second dinner was lamb again, because I wanted to see whether she would criticize the same dish she had praised months earlier. She did mildly, and I noted the inconsistency without reacting to it. Gerald was quieter that evening, checking his phone more often, excusing himself twice to take calls in the other room. Renata filled the silence by talking about plans, vaguely at first, then with increasing specificity as the wine loosened her. She mentioned that Gerald had been wonderful about helping her get organized, that they had been meeting with someone who specialized in family trusts, that it was so important to have these things in place before anything unexpected happened. I asked innocently, what kind of unexpected things? She said, oh, health changes, one of us becoming unable to manage things, the usual concerns. She looked at me when she said it, not cruelly, but with the calm assessment of someone who has already assigned you a role in a story they are telling themselves. I smiled and passed the bread. What I learned over those 2 dinners was this. Renata's debt was larger than I had realized, accumulated over years of living slightly beyond her means, and compounded by a divorce settlement that had not gone in her favor. She had been circling our family's assets for longer than 8 months, perhaps as long as 2 years, dropping hints to Gerald about estate planning and protection, and what a shame it would be if something happened and everything got complicated. She had convinced him gradually that planning for my decline was not betrayal but prudence. That framing mattered. It allowed Gerald to believe he was being responsible rather than disloyal. It allowed Renata to position herself as a concerned sister rather than an interested party. The incapacity clause was not a safeguard. It was a door she intended to walk through, and she had spent years building the hallway. Meanwhile, Claire was working on a parallel track that I did not discuss with anyone, except in brief, careful calls from my car or the library parking lot. Under the existing terms of our trust, I had equal authority with Gerald to request documentation and review any proposed amendments. Claire had written a formal letter to the attorney Gerald had been working with, this Philip Sloan, noting that as co-trustee, I was exercising my right to receive copies of all draft amendments and correspondence related to our joint property trust. The letter was polite, procedural, entirely routine. It did not mention suspicion or concern. It simply established, on paper, that I was aware of my rights and intended to use them. Sloane's office acknowledged receipt and said they would be in touch. They were slower to produce the documents than they should have been, which told Claire something about the instructions they had received. Delay is often a confession of sorts. Deanne arrived on a Thursday, carrying a small suitcase and the excuse that she had needed a break from her routine and wanted to see us. Gerald seemed pleased, but slightly wary. He asked whether everything was all right at home, whether her husband was well, whether the drive had been difficult. Diane answered each question with the kind of easy assurance that made further questions seem unnecessary. She hugged me in the kitchen while Gerald carried her bag upstairs, and in that embrace she whispered, "I am here, and I am watching." I whispered back, "I know." And then we separated and began talking about the weather as if nothing significant had passed between us. Having Diane in the house changed the dynamics in ways I had anticipated and ways I had not. Gerald and Renata became more careful, their conversations quieter, their glances at each other less frequent. But they did not stop. They simply adjusted, the way people adjust when they believe an inconvenience is temporary. Renata still came for dinner on Sunday, though she was more reserved than usual, complimenting the meal without qualification and asking Diane pleasant questions about her life. Diane answered with a warmth that surprised me given what she knew. Later she told me she had learned long ago that the way to observe people was to make them feel observed approvingly. People relax when they think you like them. They say more than they intend to. The 6 weeks passed in this strange doubled rhythm, the surface of my life, continuing as it always had, while underneath I was cataloging, documenting, preparing. I kept my notebook in my handbag, never in the house, because I did not trust that Renata was not still entering when I was away. I photographed every financial statement that arrived. I saved every email Gerald sent me, even the mundane ones, because mundane communication is itself a kind of evidence. A woman who answers routine emails coherently is not a woman in cognitive decline. I made sure to be visibly competent in small ways that could be verified later, scheduling my own doctor's appointment and keeping the confirmation, paying for groceries with a card that generated a dated receipt, sending Diane a text message with specific details about a book I was reading that proved I could follow complex narrative and remember it accurately. None of this felt paranoid to me. It felt like the only rational response to discovering that the people closest to me were constructing an alternate version of who I was. The scene I remember most clearly from those weeks happened on a Tuesday evening, about 10 days before the meeting Gerald had scheduled. He came into the kitchen while I was washing lettuce for a salad, stood by the counter with his arms crossed, and told me we needed to talk about something coming up. I dried my hands and turned to face him, keeping my expression open, slightly uncertain, the face of a woman who was not sure what he was about to say. He said, gently, that he had been thinking a lot about our future, about making sure everything was in order. He said he had asked Renata and a few of his cousins to come over next weekend for a conversation about family matters. Estate planning, he said, making sure everyone was on the same page. He said he knew I had been overwhelmed lately, and that he did not want to stress me, but it was important for me to be there, at least for part of it. I asked what kind of estate planning he meant. He hesitated, just slightly, then said it was about the trust, about making sure there was a structure in place if anything ever happened to either of us. He said he had been working with a lawyer, a very good one, someone Renata had recommended, and that there were some updates that needed to be made. He said I did not need to worry about the details. He would explain everything. I asked whether I should call our accountant to prepare anything. He smiled, the patient smile I had once found reassuring and now recognized as a mask. "No, sweetheart," he said. "You don't need to prepare anything. Just be there. We'll go through it slowly, and I'll make sure you understand." I nodded. I thanked him for telling me. I asked what day, and he said Saturday, around 2 o'clock, and I said I would make sure to have coffee ready, and maybe some of the lemon cookies his cousins liked. He looked relieved. He kissed my forehead and went back to the den, and I stood in the kitchen with the lettuce, still damp in the colander, breathing slowly, watching the last of the daylight move across the window glass. He believed I was confused. He believed his careful, condescending explanation had landed on a woman who would show up obediently to a meeting she did not understand, nod along to language designed to reduce her, and sign whatever was placed in front of her, because her husband told her it was fine. He believed this because he had decided to believe it, because believing it made what he was doing feel like care rather than theft. I knew exactly what the meeting was for. I knew who would be there and why. I knew what they planned to present and how they expected me to respond. I knew the lawyer would have documents ready. And I knew the language those documents would contain because Claire's colleague had finally obtained a copy through the formal request we had filed. I knew Renata's debt was the engine driving the timeline, and that Gerald's willingness to sacrifice me was the fuel. I knew all of it, and I stood in my kitchen with my hands still damp and my heart very steady, and thought about how a woman who has been underestimated her entire life eventually learns to make that underestimation into a weapon. The days between that conversation and the meeting passed with a calm that surprised even me. I cooked. I cleaned. I answered Gerald's questions about what I was reading and whether I had remembered to call the plumber. I let him remind me of things I already knew. I played the part so well that I sometimes caught myself wondering whether the part was becoming real, whether I was actually slipping into the role I had designed. Then I would go to the library, sit in my car and call Claire, and the sound of her precise legal language would remind me who I still was underneath the performance. The night before the meeting, I set the table for the next day. I laid out the good napkins, the ones I used for occasions that mattered. I placed my mother's painted bowl at the center, empty, waiting. I stood back and looked at the arrangement and thought about all the meals that table had held, all the conversations, all the years. Then I went upstairs, kissed Gerald goodnight, and lay in the dark planning every word I would say when the time came. They thought they were inviting me to my own diminishment. They had no idea they were walking into mine. Saturday arrived the way significant days often do, disguised as ordinary. The light through the bedroom window was pale and even. Gerald was already up when I woke, which was unusual for a weekend, and I could hear him downstairs moving through the kitchen with a kind of purposeful energy that told me he had been awake for some time, rehearsing. I lay still for a few minutes, looking at the ceiling, running through my own preparation one more time. The documents were in a leather folio in the trunk of my car, placed there the night before so there would be no chance of Gerald seeing me carry them out. Claire would arrive at 1:45 and park on the next street over, close enough to come in if I texted, but far enough not to be noticed. Diane had stayed overnight at a hotel rather than in our guest room, because we had agreed her presence at the table would be more powerful if Gerald did not know she was coming until she was already there. Everything had been arranged. All that remained was the execution. I showered, dressed in a blouse I liked and slacks that made me feel competent, and went downstairs to make coffee. Gerald looked up when I entered the kitchen and smiled in a way that might have moved me once. He asked how I had slept. I said, fine, thank you, and asked whether he wanted eggs. He said no, he was too keyed up to eat much, and then caught himself and added that he just meant there was a lot to go over today. I nodded and poured myself a cup of coffee and watched him over the rim as I drank it. He had no idea that I had already read the documents he planned to present. He had no idea that his lawyer had been formally notified of my co-trustee rights 3 weeks earlier. He had no idea that the woman standing across from him with sleep still in the corners of her eyes had spent 6 weeks building a case that would make his careful plans collapse under their own weight. The asymmetry of knowledge between us felt almost physical, a pressure in the room that only I could sense. The cousins arrived first. Martin and Edward, 2 men in their 60s whom I had always liked in the vague, distant way you like relatives you see 3 times a year. They seemed slightly uncomfortable, which suggested Gerald had not told them much about what the meeting involved. They greeted me warmly, accepted coffee, and made small talk about traffic and the weather, and Martin's new grandchild. I smiled and answered their questions and watched the door. Renata arrived at 1:15, carrying a folder and wearing an expression of focused pleasantness that I recognized from decades of watching people, prepared to manage a difficult guest. She hugged me briefly, a hug that landed on my shoulders rather than embracing me fully, and said I looked well. I thanked her and offered her coffee. She declined and asked where Gerald was. I said he was in the den setting up. She nodded and went to join him, and I stood in the kitchen for a moment, with my hands pressed flat against the counter, breathing slowly. The lawyer arrived at 1:30. Philip Sloan was a trim man in his late 50s with silver hair and the kind of professionally neutral expression that comes from years of delivering complicated news. He shook my hand politely and said it was nice to meet me. And I realized with a small cold jolt that we had never met, that my husband had hired this man to restructure my life and had not once thought to introduce us. I smiled and showed him to the dining room, where Gerald had arranged chairs around the table in a configuration that placed me at one end, slightly apart from the others. That detail would have bothered me once. Now I simply noted it as evidence. At 1:40, the doorbell rang again. Gerald looked up, frowning slightly, and said he was not expecting anyone else. I said I would get it and walked to the front door with a steadiness that surprised me. Diane was standing on the porch, overnight bag in hand, wearing a cardigan I had given her 2 Christmases ago. She looked at me with the particular calm that meant she was ready, and I stepped aside to let her in. I walked with her to the dining room. The reaction when we entered was subtle but unmistakable. Gerald's face went through several changes in this second, surprise and confusion, and then a careful rearrangement into welcome. He stood and hugged Diane and asked why she had not told us she was coming. She said she had wanted to surprise us, that she had been worried about Mom and wanted to check in. The word Mom landed in the room like a stone in still water. Renata's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. The cousins looked confused but pleased. Sloan looked at Gerald with a question in his eyes, and Gerald gave a small shake of his head that was probably meant to be invisible but was not. We all sat down. Gerald cleared his throat and said he was glad everyone could be here, that he had been thinking a lot about family and the future, and making sure everyone was protected. He said he knew it was not the most exciting topic, but it was important and he appreciated everyone's patience. He looked at me as he said it, a soft, concerned look that I had once believed was love. Then he nodded to Sloan, who opened his own folder and began to speak. I let him talk for about 4 minutes. He explained that trusts were complicated instruments, that it was wise to review them periodically, that circumstances changed and documents should reflect those changes. He said that Gerald had expressed some concerns about continuity of management and had asked him to draft an amendment that would provide additional oversight in certain situations. He used words like protection and safeguard and family support. He did not use words like incapacity or diminished function. Not yet, but I could hear them waiting in the wings of his careful sentences. When he paused to take a breath, I spoke. I said, "Excuse me," and my voice was level and clear in a way that made everyone at the table turn toward me. I said I appreciated everyone being here, and understood that this meeting was meant to discuss changes to our family trust. I said that before we went any further, I had some materials I wanted to share. Gerald started to interrupt, something gentle and redirecting, but I was already reaching for the folio I had placed under my chair when I sat down. I set it on the table in front of me and opened it. The room went very quiet. Even the cousins, who had no idea what was happening, seemed to sense that the temperature had changed. I began with the trust amendment draft. I placed it on the table and said this was a copy of the document Mr. Sloan had been preparing, obtained through a formal request I had filed as co-trustee 3 weeks ago. I said I had read it carefully and wanted to make sure everyone else had the opportunity to read it as well. I slid copies across the table to Martin and Edward, who looked down at the pages with expressions of growing confusion. I read aloud the section concerning co-trustee authority in the event of my cognitive incapacity. I read aloud the clause naming Renata as the proposed assisting co-trustee. I read aloud the note in the margin, in Gerald's handwriting, suggesting the trigger language be broadened so that a formal diagnosis would not be required. Then I set the page down and looked at my husband. He opened his mouth to speak, but I continued before he could. I placed the email thread on the table next. Copies for everyone. I said these were messages between Gerald and Mr. Sloan discussing the amendment, including language about my supposed forgetfulness and resistance to assistance. I read aloud the phrase about preserving dignity while giving Renata authority. I asked whether anyone at the table would like to explain what that phrase meant in practice. Renata shifted in her chair. Gerald was staring at the papers, as if they might burst into flames and save him. I placed the financial records on the table. I said these were statements showing 2 transfers from our joint savings account, totaling just under $20,000, to an account that Claire's colleague had traced to Renata. I asked whether Gerald would like to explain those transfers, since he had told me they were a temporary bridge loan related to her condo purchase, but the dates did not align with her closing, and the money had not been returned. "Renata," said Margaret, and her voice was higher than usual. "Margaret, this is not what it looks like." I placed the next document on the table. I said this was a transcript of a phone call I had overheard between Renata and Gerald 6 weeks earlier, recorded legally under the one-party consent law in our state. I read aloud the relevant portions. "The timeline needs to move. She already doubts herself. She won't contest it if she thinks it's her idea." I asked whether anyone at the table would like to explain what those sentences meant. The silence in the room was extraordinary. I had managed difficult silences before. Hotel conference rooms where a contract had fallen through or a serious complaint had surfaced, but I had never felt one quite like this. It was not just the absence of speech, it was the presence of something exposed, something that had been carefully covered for months now suddenly visible to everyone at the table. Sloane spoke first. He said, very quietly, that he had not been made aware of the full context of the family situation, that he had relied on his client's representations, and that under the circumstances he thought it best to excuse himself from the meeting. He gathered his folder, nodded stiffly to the room, and left without shaking anyone's hand. The front door closed behind him with a sound that seemed louder than it should have been. Gerald finally spoke. His voice was different than it had been at the start of the meeting, lower and rougher, stripped of the careful warmth he had been performing. He said I had misunderstood. He said he had only been trying to make sure there was a plan in place, that Renata had been worried about me, that none of this was meant to harm me. He said he loved me and always had. I looked at him, across the table, across the papers that documented what he had done, across 31 years of Sunday dinners and shared accounts and bed we had slept in together while he was planning this. I asked him one question. Did you think I wouldn't notice? Or did you think it didn't matter if I did? He did not answer. His mouth moved slightly, but no words came out. The cousins were looking at him now, with expressions that had shifted from confusion to something harder to name. Edward set down the papers he had been holding, and pushed them slightly away from himself, as if distance might excuse him from what they contained. Renata tried again. She leaned forward, her voice taking on the bright, reasonable tone of someone attempting to salvage a situation through sheer force of framing. She said this was a misunderstanding, that everything they had done was out of concern for me, that Gerald had noticed I was struggling and he had come to her for advice and she had simply tried to help. She said nobody wanted to hurt me. She said the word protection 3 times in 4 sentences. I let her finish. Then I placed the final document on the table. It was a letter from my physician, Dr. Annette Warren, dated 3 weeks before the meeting. It confirmed that I had undergone a comprehensive cognitive assessment at my own request. It stated that I showed no signs of memory impairment, confusion, or diminished executive function. It noted that my reasoning, recall, and decision-making capacities were fully intact and consistent with normal cognitive aging. It concluded by stating that in her professional opinion, there was no medical basis for any claim of incapacity. I set the letter in front of Renata and said I thought she might want to read this. She picked it up. I watched her eyes move over the words, watched the realization settle into her face. She set it down without speaking. I looked around the table. The cousins looked like they wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Gerald was staring at his hands, which were flat on the table in front of him, not moving. Renata was very still, the letter lying between us like something that had once been alive. I said I wanted to be clear about what would happen next. I said Claire Ashford, my attorney, was parked outside and prepared to file an emergency motion to freeze all joint accounts and prevent any amendments to the trust until a full review could be conducted. I said I had copies of everything that had been presented today, plus additional documentation I had not shared, and that all of it would be made available to the court if necessary. I said I was not interested in revenge, but I was also not interested in pretending this had not happened. I said I would be consulting with Claire about my options for legal separation and for recovery of the funds that had been transferred without my consent. Then I stood up. I looked at Gerald one more time, not with anger and not with tears, but with something I could not have named if you had asked me. Maybe it was the last thread of the marriage, finally snapping cleanly, after weeks of fraying under tension. I said Diane and I are going outward at her. I said when I came back, I expected the house to be empty of everyone except him, and I expected him to be ready to have a very different kind of conversation. I picked up the folio with my remaining documents. Diane stood up beside me. We walked out of the dining rooms together, past the kitchen where I had made so many meals, past the hallway where I had first overheard the phone call that started all of this, through the front door and out into the late afternoon light. Claire was parked on the next street, exactly where she had said she would be. We got into her car, Diane in the back and me in the passenger seat, and for a long moment none of us spoke. Then Claire asked how it had gone. I told her the lawyer had left before I finished. She smiled, just slightly, and said that was a good sign. I leaned back against the headrest and closed my eyes. I could feel Diane's hand on my shoulder from the back seat, steady and warm. The engine started. The car began to move. And I thought about my mother's painted bowl, still sitting on the table in a room full of people who had tried to convince me I was less than I was. It would be there when I got back. It had held everything before this, and it would hold whatever came after. What followed was not a storm. I want to be precise about that, because when people hear the word fallout, they imagine noise and wreckage and scenes played out at high volume. What actually followed was more like the aftermath of a flood, quiet, procedural, and exhausting in the specific way that comes not from drama but from the sheer weight of necessary tasks. There were phone calls to make, and documents to review, and decisions to arrive at one by one, each one reasonable and logical and quietly devastating. I moved through them the way I had moved through difficult operational periods in my working life, not by refusing to feel what I felt, but by deciding that feeling and functioning were not mutually exclusive. You can grieve and still read a document correctly. You can be heartbroken and still notice when a number is wrong. Claire filed the formal objection to the trust amendment on the Monday following the meeting. The grounds were several and layered, but the most significant was straightforward. Under the existing terms of our joint revocable trust, no amendment could be executed without the written consent of both trustees, which meant me. Gerald had not merely been careless. He had been attempting to ratify a document to which he knew I had not consented, and to which, given its explicit purpose, I could not reasonably be expected to consent. The amendment was invalidated within 3 weeks, which was faster than Claire had initially projected, and which she attributed to the quality of the documentation we had assembled. Philip Sloane did not contest the objection. He withdrew from the matter entirely, and sent a letter to Claire's office that was politely worded and very carefully said nothing that could be used against him, while still communicating, between its lines, that he wished he had asked more questions before taking the case. I did not feel satisfaction reading that letter. I felt the particular weariness of watching someone protect themselves at the last possible moment and call it professionalism. The money took longer. There had been 3 transfers in total, not 2 as I had initially discovered. The third, smaller transfer of just over $4,000 had occurred 2 weeks before the meeting. While I had been performing confusion in my own kitchen, and Gerald had been continuing to move our shared resources into an account connected to his sister, the total was $41,200. Claire sent a formal demand letter to Renata's attorney, a man she had evidently retained in a hurry, outlining the nature of the transfers, the lack of documentation supporting any legitimate loan agreement, and the legal exposure Renata faced if the matter proceeded to litigation. The letter mentioned the word fraud once, in a subordinate clause without emphasis, the way you might mention a fire exit. You do not need to point at it loudly. Everyone in the room notices it, Renata returned the money in 2 installments over 6 weeks. The first installment arrived quietly, without comment, as an electronic transfer into the joint account. The second took a reminder from Claire, sent on a Tuesday morning with the pleasant efficiency of someone who has done this before and will continue doing it for as long as necessary. The second installment arrived by Thursday. There was no accompanying note either time, no apology, no explanation. Just the money appearing in the account like something trying to pretend it had never left. I did not celebrate. I logged both transfers, forwarded the confirmations to Claire, and made myself a cup of tea. $41,000 is not a small amount of money, and recovering it mattered practically as well as symbolically. But I had understood for some time that the money was never really the point. The money was the evidence. The actual injury was something that does not show up on a bank statement. Gerald was quiet in the weeks following the meeting. Not remorseful, not exactly, or at least not in any way that resembled the remorse of someone who understood what they had actually done. He moved through the house carefully, giving me wide berth, answering when spoken to, and initiating conversation, only when the practical requirements of shared life demanded it. He reminded me once of an upcoming dental appointment, and then seemed to realize the irony of reminding me of anything and stopped mid-sentence. He made his own coffee in the mornings. He stopped sitting at the table after dinner and retreated to the den instead, which meant I had the kitchen to myself in the evenings, quiet and lamplit, and mine in a way it had not felt for months. I watched him carefully during those weeks, not because I still hoped to find something retrievable in him, but because understanding what he had done required understanding at being who he had decided to be when he thought no one was looking. What I observed was a man who was not struggling with guilt. He was struggling with exposure. Those are different things, and the difference matters. Guilt would have looked like regret, like apology, like some attempt to account for the specific harm done. What Gerald showed was the behavior of a person recalculating. He was quiet because he was figuring out what his options were now that the first plan had failed. He was careful around me because I had demonstrated that I was capable of more than he had assumed, and he was revising his assumptions accordingly. He had not treated me as a woman to be protected. He had treated me as a variable to be managed. And now the variable had proven unmanageable and he was adjusting. That realization was the one that made separation inevitable. Not the documents, not the money, not even the phone call I had overheard. Those things told me what he had done. This told me who he was. There is a particular kind of betrayal that comes not from passion or desperation or weakness, but from a cold, quiet calculation that the person beside you is more useful managed than respected. Gerald had not acted in a moment of panic. He had planned across months, with lawyers and meetings and carefully revised language, and he had done it while kissing my cheek and asking whether I wanted toast and saying sweetheart in that measured tone. That was not a man who had made a terrible mistake. That was a man who had made a deliberate choice and called it care. And there is no amount of marital history that makes a woman safe beside a man who thinks that way. I have not told you about Renata's phone call to Diane, because I wanted to save it for here, where its meaning lands most clearly. It came on a Wednesday evening, about 3 weeks after the meeting, when the legal matters were still in progress, and the household was still suspended in the particular atmosphere of two people occupying the same space while separately deciding what comes next. Renata called Diane on her personal cell, which she had the number for from years of family gatherings and holidays, and she asked Diane to consider whether she was really helping anyone by encouraging her mother's paranoia. Diane recorded the call. She said nothing to me about it until the following morning, when she forwarded the audio file with a text that contained no words, just the file and the small icon of a paperclip. I listened to it once, which was enough. Renata's voice was careful at the beginning of the call, measured in that way she had, the concerned tone she deployed like a tool. She told Diane that Margaret had always been sensitive, that Gerald was heartbroken, that the situation had been blown entirely out of proportion by legal interference. She said Diane did not understand the full picture because she did not live nearby and had not seen how Margaret had struggled. She used the word struggling 3 times and the word confused twice, and each time she used them, I heard the same architecture I had overheard in the hallway months earlier, the same structure, the same framing, just adjusted for a new audience. She told Diane it was not too late to help the family find a resolution. She said she hoped Diane would think about what was really best for everyone. Diane had let her finish. Then Diane had thanked her for calling and said she would give it some thought, and ended the conversation with the pleasant neutrality she had clearly inherited from me. Then she had sent me the recording. I forwarded it to Claire. It was not legally significant in any new way by that point, but it was clarifying. It confirmed that Renata had not experienced the meeting as a reckoning. She had experienced it as a setback, and she was already working around the edges of it. People who believe they were fundamentally right rarely stop. They simply look for different doors. The legal separation was filed on a Thursday in late November, on a morning when the light was thin and gray, and the leaves had been off the trees for 2 weeks already. Claire had prepared everything. I had reviewed it carefully, which I told her was unnecessary, and did so anyway. Because I am not a woman who signs documents she has not read, not anymore, not ever again if I can help it. The filing was clean and straightforward. Joint assets were to be frozen pending equitable distribution. The trust, now fully intact under my restored authority, would be reviewed by a neutral party. Gerald would retain his own counsel, which he had done by that point, a man from a firm across town who specialized in divorce rather than estate planning, and whose involvement confirmed that Gerald too had finally accepted what kind of situation this was. I sat in Claire's office after signing and looked at the stack of pages with signature at the bottom of each one. My name, in my own handwriting, clear and consistent and exactly as it had always been. Not the signature of a confused woman, not the signature of someone whose executive function was diminished, just my name, the same as it had been for 64 years, the same as it had been on every invoice I had ever approved, every contract I had ever signed, every document that had ever required the affirmation that I was present, competent, and entirely aware of what I was agreeing to. Claire asked if I was all right. I told her I was not sure yet, which was the most honest thing I had said out loud in weeks. She nodded and said that was a reasonable answer. She offered me a cup of coffee and I accepted it, and we sat for a while without talking about anything important, which was, I found, exactly what I needed. That afternoon I went to the bank and opened an individual account in my name only, and transferred my share of the joint savings into it under the agreed terms of the separation filing. It took 40 minutes including the wait. The woman who helped me was young and professional and asked me 3 times if I had any questions, and each time I said no. Thank you, I understand completely. She printed my account summary and slid it across the desk in a folder with the bank's name on it. I put it in my handbag beside my notebook, the small blue one I had been keeping since the beginning of all this, now nearly full. I drove home in the early dark of a November afternoon and sat in the driveway for a moment before going inside. The house was lit from within, Gerald's den lamp visible through the front window, the kitchen light on because I had left it on that morning. In a few weeks the house would be assessed. In a few months there would be another set of documents, more signatures, more procedures. There would be conversations with Diane about logistics, and with solicitors about timelines, and with myself, in the quiet of early mornings, about what came next, but that was not what I was thinking about in the driveway. I was thinking about how the word clarity is so often used interchangeably with happiness, as if the two things were the same. They are not the same. Clarity is sometimes the loneliest thing in the world. It shows you exactly where you are and exactly how you arrived there and leaves you no room for comforting ambiguity. There was no version of events in which I had misunderstood. There was no charitable interpretation left. There was only what had happened and what I had done about it, and what I would now have to build from the ground up, without the structure I had believed was holding me. I got out of the car. I went inside. I made dinner for one, which was something I had not done in 31 years, and I set one place at the table, and I sat down and ate it. It was a simple meal, soup and bread, nothing that required care or presentation or the right bowl at the center. It was just food. warm and sufficient, and I ate it and cleared my plate and washed up. And that was enough for one day. Some days, being enough is the whole of it. 6 months is not a long time. I want to say that plainly before I tell you how things look from here, because I have watched enough difficult chapters in enough people's lives to know that 6 months does not constitute a recovery. It constitutes a beginning. The difference between those two things matters, and I am not willing to tidy this story into something neater than it actually is, just because we have arrived at the end of it. What I can tell you is that 6 months is long enough to know the difference between a life that is over and a life that has simply changed shape, and the one I am living now has changed shape considerably. The apartment is on the 3rd floor of a building in a town, 20 miles from where I spent 31 years of my marriage. I had always liked this town. It has a good Saturday market and a library with large windows and a coffee shop on the main street that opens early enough for the kind of person who has never quite managed to sleep past 6. Gerald had not disliked it, exactly. He simply had no feeling for it, and for a long time that absence of feeling in him had been enough to prevent us from ever seriously considering it. That is one of the quieter ways a long marriage can limit you. The slow accumulation of another person's indifferences shaping the boundaries of what you imagine as possible. You stop wanting certain things not because you no longer want them, but because wanting them has proven over years to lead nowhere. You file the want away. You forget which drawer you put it in. I remembered this one. The apartment has south-facing windows in the kitchen and the living room, which means that on clear mornings, the light comes in at an angle that makes even ordinary things look considered. The floorboards are old and creak in 2 places near the bathroom door, which I have decided to regard as character rather than fault. There is a small balcony where I have put a container of herbs, rosemary and thyme, and a basil plant that requires more attention than it probably deserves, but that I find myself giving attention to anyway. Because tending something small and living turns out to be good for a person in ways that are difficult to articulate and easy to feel. The building has a lobby that smells faintly of old wood and floor wax, and a neighbor on the 2nd floor named Patricia who leaves the elevator for me when she hears my key in the lobby door, a courtesy so small and consistent it has become one of the things I look forward to without meaning to. I took the consulting role in October, which was 3 months after the separation was finalized, and 4 months after I moved into the apartment. A woman named Helen, who runs a small group of boutique hotel properties along the coast, reached out through a mutual contact from my working years. She had heard through the particular grapevine that connects people who have spent long careers in the same industry, that I was available and that my background in food and beverage operations was the kind that did not become obsolete with time. She asked whether I would consider coming in 2 days a week to help with the operational restructuring of one property that was underperforming, to look at where the systems had loosened and help tighten them. I said I would think about it, which I did for approximately 48 hours before calling her back and saying yes. The work is part-time and I intend to keep it that way. I go in on Tuesdays and Thursdays. I walk the floor, I read the reports, I sit in the kitchen during service and watch the rhythm of the room, and I offer my observations with the directness that I have always believed is the most respectful thing you can give a person who is trying to improve. The staff are younger than the staff I managed in my working years, which is simply a fact of time, and they are good at what they do in the ways that matter, and still learning in the ways that also matter. I find I enjoy the combination. There is something clarifying about being useful in a context where your usefulness is sought rather than managed around. Helen told me last month that the property's weekend covers had increased by 18% since I started. I said that was good to hear. She asked if I would consider expanding my days. I said I would think about it. I am thinking about it. Slowly and on my own terms, which is the only way I intend to think about anything from now on. The bowl is on the kitchen table. I took it on moving day, which was a cold morning in late January with ice on the windshields and a sky the color of old pewter. Gerald stood in the doorway of the house while the hired movers worked, watching with an expression I could not quite categorize. Not grief, not anger. Something more like a man watching a ship Leave a harbor, aware that he had missed the boarding and not entirely certain whether that was his fault or the ship's. I went through the kitchen last, checking the cabinets and the drawer beside the stove, where I kept the good scissors, and when I had everything, turned and looked at the table, and the bowl was there at the center of it, the way it had always been, cream-colored with its border of small blue flowers, the chip on the inner rim, the slightly faded side that had faced too many sunny windows across too many years. I picked it up with both hands. Gerald saw me from the doorway. He said nothing. I carried it out to my car and set it on the passenger seat with a folded dish towel underneath it, and I drove away. It sits on my new kitchen table in the light from the south-facing windows, and it is, as it has always been, either empty or full, depending on the season and the occasion. Right now it holds 3 clementines and a small pine cone that my granddaughter Lily pressed into my hand on her last visit, solemnly, as if she were entrusting me with something important. Perhaps she was. She is 5 years old and has her mother's eyes and the habit of making pronouncements about ordinary things with the seriousness of someone delivering news. She told me my apartment smelled like cookies, which it did not, and that the bowl was pretty, which it is, and that she wanted to come back next Sunday. I told her that next Sunday sounded exactly right. Diane has brought the children twice now for Sunday dinners. The first time I was nervous in a way I would not have predicted. Not about the food or the space, but about whether the ritual would hold in a new room, whether Sunday dinner could transfer from one life to another the way the bowl had transferred, or whether it was too bound up in the house, in the table that was no longer mine, in a version of things that no longer existed. I set the table anyway. I cooked anyway. I lit a candle, one taper in a plain glass holder, because the Portuguese brass ones are still in storage while the house is in the process of being sold. And I stood back and looked at the table and thought about all the times I had stood back and looked at a table and decided it was right. It was right. Different and right. The children ate enthusiastically and without opinions about the quality of the food, which is one of the great gifts of grandchildren. Lily arranged the clementines in the bowl while Diane and I had coffee after dinner, and we sat at the small table in my new kitchen, with the January dark outside the windows, and I thought about how much of what I had believed was irreplaceable had simply been waiting to be carried somewhere else. I have not spoken to Gerald since the finalization of our divorce, which was completed 2 months ago. There will be practical communications in the future, because 31 years of shared life does not untangle without ongoing administration. But we have arranged to route most of it through Claire and his attorney, which suits us both. I do not know whether he has spoken to Renata. I do not know what story they are telling each other, or themselves about what happened and why. I have made peace with not knowing. There is a version of this story in which I need them to understand what they did, and I want to be honest with you. I wanted that version for a while. I wanted them to sit with the full weight of it, to lose sleep the way I had lost sleep, to feel the particular loneliness of having built something dishonest and watched it taken apart. I am human. I wanted the thing that people who have been wronged usually want, which is not just justice but comprehension. I wanted them to know what they had done. I have let that go. Not because they deserve my peace, they do not, but because needing them to understand is another way of letting them govern my interior life. And they governed it for long enough. Here is what I know, 6 months out, in a light-filled apartment in a town I always loved. I know that I was not confused. I know that I was not declining. I know that I was, in fact, so thoroughly present and competent during the worst of it that I was able to document my own clarity in real time, to build a case so complete that a lawyer excused himself from the room rather than sit inside it. I know that what was done to me was not done out of love, or concern, or any of the other words that were used to describe it. It was done out of calculation, dressed in the language of care, sustained by the assumption that I had already become someone who could not protect herself. That assumption was wrong. It has always been wrong. And the cost of learning how wrong it was is something I am still, quietly, every day accounting for. But here is the other thing I know. The table I set was always beautiful. I just finally stopped inviting people who couldn't see it. I want you to hear that as more than a line about dinner parties. Because it is about every table you have ever set, every effort you have made that was received as ordinary, or as evidence of your decline, or as an opportunity. Every meal cooked and napkin folded and candle lit in a room where someone had already decided you were less than you were. The table was always beautiful. You were always more than they needed you to be for their plan to work. What changed was simply that you stopped handing them the invitation. They called it protecting me. But protection that requires your silence is just control with better manners. I have thought about this more than almost anything else in the past 6 months. The language of protection is so effective because it appeals to something real, to the genuine human desire to be cared for, to the vulnerability that comes with aging and change and the ordinary uncertainties of a long life. We want to be looked after. We want someone to notice when the weight gets heavy, and people who mean to harm you have always known that. The ones who are good at it do not arrive with demands. They arrive with concern. They ask how you are sleeping. They gently note that you seem tired. They explain patiently that they are doing this for you, all of it for you, while their hands are already in the drawer. If the protection they are offering requires you to be quiet, to be manageable, to stop asking questions, to stop reading the documents, it is not protection. It has never been protection. Call it what it is and then do what I did. Read the documents. Ask the questions. Make the call. Park your lawyer 2 streets over and let them find out what you already know. I didn't win by fighting. I won by refusing to keep losing quietly. The fighting, in the end, was not the hard part. The hard part was the 6 weeks before the meeting, when I was performing confusion in my own kitchen, when I was letting my husband explain things to me in a slow, careful voice while I memorized every word. The hard part was lying in the dark beside someone I had trusted for 31 years, listening to him breathe, knowing what I knew and choosing to wait. The hard part was the patience, the long, precise patience of someone who understands that timing is not weakness. Knowing when to speak is not the same as being afraid to. I was not afraid to confront them. I was strategic about when the confrontation would be unanswerable. That is a very different thing, and I want you to remember it, because I think many of you have been told that your patience was passivity, that your composure was confusion, that your silence was surrender. It was not. Sometimes, silence is the loudest thing in the room. Sometimes the most powerful move is to wait until the table is fully set, in the right room, with the right witnesses, and then sit down. Before I close, I want to speak to you directly, not to Margaret, the narrator, not to the woman in the story. To you, if you are watching this and recognizing something, I want you to take a breath. I want you to understand that recognition is not the same as acceptance. You can recognize what is being done to you and still decide what comes next. You are not too old to read the documents. You are not too far into the situation to make a call. You are not obligated to remain in any room that was designed to make you smaller. Find your Claire. Find your Diane. Let your Mrs. Alvarez across the street tell you what she has been seeing. And then go home, open the drawer, and start keeping notes. You have more time than they are counting on. You have more clarity than they have told you. And you have, I promise, more options than it feels like on the days when the floor seems to have shifted underfoot. Start with the documents. Start with one honest conversation with one person you trust outside the circle they have drawn. Start with writing the date in a small blue notebook and trusting what you know. If this story reached you today, please share it with someone who might need it. You do not have to explain why. Just send it quietly, the way one woman hands another a key and says, "This might be useful." Leave me a comment below telling me one thing you stopped tolerating this year. It does not have to be large. It does not have to be dramatic. The smallest things are often the ones that change the most, and if no one has told you lately, you are still here. You are still thinking clearly. You are still in all the ways that matter entirely yourself. The table is set. Sit down.